Imagine being torn away from your home, your family, your friends, and everything that makes you feel safe and known. Imagine being forced onto a ship, cramped below deck with hundreds of others. The air thick and suffocating, the stench unbearable, and no end in sight. This was the reality for millions of Africans between 1500 and 1880, when an estimated 10 to 12 million men, women, and children were forcibly transported across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. Their journey, known as the Middle Passage, was one of unimaginable hardship, where roughly 15% of those aboard did not survive the voyage. The Atlantic slave trade is a chapter of history that is often overlooked or simplified in schools, yet its impact shaped entire continents, economies, and societies. These were real people with names, families, cultures, and skills: farmers, artisans, merchants, parents, and children stripped of their identities and treated as cargo. On the ships, they faced extreme overcrowding, starvation, disease, and abuse. With little hope of survival, many were chained together for the entire journey, unable to move freely, with only the bare minimum of food and water to keep them alive. Understanding this history is not just about numbers or statistics, it is about recognizing the human suffering and resilience that defined this era. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is also a story of courage, survival, and resistance. Despite the unimaginable conditions, countless individuals found ways to endure, support one another, and, in some cases, resist the system that sought to dehumanize them. Their legacy is one of strength, endurance, and a reminder of the consequences of systemic injustice. In this video, we are going to take a deep dive into the untold aspects of the Atlantic slave trade, exploring not only the journey itself but also the social, cultural, and economic forces that made it possible. We will examine the origins of the captives, the trade networks that spanned continents, and the daily realities aboard the ships. We will also highlight stories of resistance and survival, showing the humanity that persisted even under the harshest conditions. If you want to understand history that goes beyond the textbooks, to hear the stories that were too often silenced, this video is for you. We will uncover the realities of a system that changed the world and left an indelible mark on human history. So make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our deep dives into history that schools may never have told you. Join us as we honor the voices of those who endured, remember the lessons of the past, and learn how these events continue to shape our world today. Stay with us, because this story is as important as it is compelling, and you will want to see every part of it. As we begin to understand the staggering scale of the Atlantic slave trade, it becomes essential to trace the origins of those whose lives were forever altered by this brutal system. Most of the enslaved people who were forced across the Atlantic came from 6 primary regions along the western and central coasts of Africa: Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Biafra, and West Central Africa, encompassing modern-day Congo and Angola. These regions, rich in culture, trade, and history, were home to thriving communities long before the arrival of European traders, and the people living there had developed intricate social, economic, and political networks that sustained their societies for centuries. In Senegambia, for instance, communities were deeply rooted in agriculture, fishing, and trade, with families maintaining land, cultivating crops, and building intergenerational bonds that formed the backbone of their societies. Sierra Leone's coastal settlements were known for their skilled craftsmen, traders, and fishermen who navigated rivers and estuaries with expertise passed down through generations, ensuring that each community remained vibrant and self-sufficient. Along the windward coast, villages and towns engaged in regional trade, sharing goods, knowledge, and cultural practices with neighboring regions while nurturing rich traditions in music, storytelling, and ceremonial practices that celebrated life and reinforced social cohesion. The Gold Coast, famed for its mineral wealth and particularly its gold reserves, was not only a hub for local commerce but also a center of political power, where local kingdoms exercised considerable authority over land and resources. Within these kingdoms, skilled artisans, blacksmiths, and merchants contributed to a thriving economy, demonstrating that the people who would later be enslaved were far from passive or marginalized. They were active participants in complex societies with distinct identities, histories, and aspirations. Moving further east to Biafra, coastal and inland communities relied on agriculture, fishing, and trade, creating a vibrant cultural tapestry enriched by diverse languages, religious practices, and social hierarchies. Biafran societies often maintained extensive networks that connected inland and coastal regions, facilitating the exchange of goods such as palm oil, salt, and textiles, and ensuring that local knowledge and cultural practices remained dynamic and influential. West Central Africa, which includes areas of present-day Congo and Angola, featured highly organized kingdoms and city-states where people engaged in trade, warfare, and diplomacy, cultivating knowledge systems that spanned medicine, agriculture, metallurgy, and governance. These regions were far from isolated. They were interconnected through networks of trade, communication, and cultural exchange, creating a rich mosaic of human achievement and social complexity that European traders would later disrupt with devastating consequences. Despite the vibrancy and resilience of these societies, the growing demand for enslaved labor in the Americas began to reshape the social and political landscapes of these African regions. European traders, arriving primarily from Portugal, Britain, France, and the Netherlands, established forts and trading posts along the coast, seeking to acquire human captives to meet the labor needs of plantations across the Atlantic. The arrival of these traders did not initially entail direct conquest. Instead, they relied on existing networks of local intermediaries who captured and sold individuals from neighboring villages, rival ethnic groups, or those deemed criminals or prisoners of war. Over time, this system grew more entrenched and more violent, as the lure of European goods, including textiles, firearms, and metal tools, incentivized local rulers and merchants to expand their involvement in capturing and selling people, often at the expense of their own communities. For those destined to endure the Middle Passage, the process began with a sudden and violent rupture from the life they knew, leaving behind homes, families, and the cultural frameworks that had defined them. Women and children were forcibly removed from their villages, sometimes under the cover of night, other times following raids and armed conflict, and brought to coastal holding facilities where they awaited transport. In these fortified enclaves, individuals were stripped of personal belongings, clothing, and even the names that connected them to their heritage, replaced instead with labels and numbers that reduced them to mere commodities. The psychological toll was immense, as families were separated, friendships shattered, and communities destabilized, all while the looming presence of European traders and armed guards made resistance a perilous endeavor. Yet even in these harrowing circumstances, the cultures of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Biafra, and West Central Africa were not entirely erased. Within the crowded and oppressive confines of the holding areas, people maintained elements of their languages, musical traditions, and rituals, quietly preserving fragments of identity that would later serve as foundations for cultural survival and adaptation in the Americas. These practices became lifelines of resilience, offering comfort, solidarity, and a shared sense of humanity in the face of dehumanization. The rich spiritual and cultural knowledge carried from these 6 regions would endure across the Atlantic, influencing music, dance, cuisine, language, and social structures in the New World, even as the individuals themselves faced the unimaginable brutality of enslavement. By understanding the origins of the enslaved Africans and the societies they left behind, we gain a deeper appreciation for the human cost of the Atlantic slave trade and the resilience that enabled survival against all odds. These 6 regions were not merely sources of labor. They were vibrant centers of human achievement, creativity, and community, whose legacies persist despite centuries of forced displacement and exploitation. Remembering their stories allows us to honor their lives, recognize the richness of African cultures, and understand the profound historical forces that shaped the modern world, underscoring the importance of empathy, historical awareness, and a commitment to justice in our own time. In the early days of European colonization in the Americas, the first settlers faced a daunting challenge: establishing profitable colonies in unfamiliar lands while relying on a labor force that could sustain the demanding agricultural and mining enterprises they envisioned. Initially, European colonists turned to the indigenous populations for labor, believing that the local people, already familiar with the land and its resources, could meet the needs of plantations and mining operations. Indigenous communities, with their intricate social structures, extensive knowledge of agriculture, and established trade networks, were suddenly confronted with demands that stretched far beyond their traditional livelihoods. Women and children were coerced into labor under harsh conditions, often for the benefit of foreign settlers whose goals were rooted in profit rather than partnership or mutual understanding. However, this initial system of forced labor faced severe obstacles, most tragically in the form of disease. Europeans carried with them pathogens to which indigenous peoples had little or no immunity, including smallpox, measles, and influenza, resulting in devastating epidemics that swept through villages and towns with alarming speed. Entire communities were decimated, and in some regions, populations plummeted by as much as 90% within decades of first contact. The combination of unfamiliar agricultural practices imposed by colonists, relentless work demands, and exposure to new diseases created a situation where indigenous labor could not be reliably sustained. Mortality rates were catastrophic, and the European settlers, desperate to maintain economic output, found themselves facing an acute labor shortage that threatened the viability of their enterprises. As the harsh reality of disease and high mortality among indigenous peoples became undeniable, European colonists began to look elsewhere for a solution to their labor needs. Africa, already known through centuries of trade and exploration, emerged as a source of people who could be forcibly brought to the Americas to perform the grueling work required on plantations and in mines. Unlike the indigenous populations, Africans had extensive experience in agriculture, metallurgy, and other skilled labor, and many came from societies that were connected through sophisticated trade networks. The knowledge of their lands, farming techniques, and resilience in the face of environmental hardships made Africans appear, to European colonists, as an ideal solution to the labor crisis they faced. This shift from indigenous to African labor was not a simple or immediate process, but rather a complex transformation shaped by economics, logistics, and the stark realities of mortality. European traders and colonists began to establish networks with African intermediaries, creating systems through which individuals could be captured, sold, and transported across the Atlantic. Coastal forts and trading posts sprang up along West and Central Africa, where captured individuals were held before being loaded onto ships for the treacherous Middle Passage. Families were torn apart, and entire communities disrupted, as men, women, and children were forcibly removed from their homelands. Those who survived the journey would face lives defined by forced labor, brutality, and the erasure of their identities. Yet they carried with them the knowledge, customs, and resilience of their African origins, seeds of cultural survival that would influence generations in the Americas. The transition from indigenous to African labor also reveals the profound interconnectedness of global events during this period. European colonists were not acting in isolation. Their decisions were informed by knowledge of geography, trade, and the human and material resources available across continents. The decimation of indigenous populations, though catastrophic, created an economic imperative that reshaped transatlantic relations and laid the foundations for the Atlantic slave trade. African societies, too, were implicated in this system in various ways, as local rulers, merchants, and communities navigated the pressures and opportunities created by European demand. Some resisted, some engaged strategically, and others were caught in the violent upheavals that accompanied the growing trade in enslaved people. Understanding this transition highlights the human cost of colonization and the cascading effects of disease, exploitation, and forced labor. It underscores how systemic factors such as the spread of new pathogens, economic pressures, and colonial ambitions intersected to produce one of the most devastating forced migrations in human history. The story of indigenous labor and its tragic failure due to disease sets the stage for the emergence of African enslavement, emphasizing the harsh choices imposed by colonial powers and the profound suffering inflicted on people across continents. Yet, amid this grim reality, the resilience and agency of both indigenous peoples and Africans persisted. Cultural practices, knowledge of the land, and social cohesion provided forms of resistance and survival that would echo across generations, shaping the identity of communities and the development of new societies in the Americas. By tracing this shift from indigenous labor to African enslavement, we gain insight not only into the economic motivations of colonists but also into the courage, endurance, and creativity of those whose lives were uprooted, offering a deeper understanding of the human stories behind the historical record and the enduring legacy of these events in the modern world. As European colonists wrestled with the challenges of building economies in the New World, a complex and far-reaching system emerged that would shape the trajectory of global commerce for centuries, a system now commonly referred to as the triangular trade. This network connected three continents: Europe, Africa, and the Americas in a relentless cycle of goods, labor, and raw materials, intertwining the fates of millions and creating wealth on a scale previously unseen. Ships laden with European manufactured goods, textiles, firearms, metal tools, and wine sailed toward the African coast, where local rulers and merchants, navigating both opportunity and caution, engaged in a trade that had been shaped by centuries of commerce and diplomacy. These goods were exchanged for people, human beings who were captured, coerced, or sold into bondage, often coming from the regions of Senegambia, Sierra Leone, the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, Biafra, and West Central Africa. where thriving communities with rich cultures and complex social structures had existed long before European intrusion. The enslaved Africans, once acquired, were transported across the treacherous Middle Passage, enduring a journey so brutal that it claimed the lives of roughly 15% of those aboard. Below decks, women and children were confined in cramped, unsanitary conditions, forced to remain chained together, fed minimally, and denied sunlight and fresh air. Disease, malnutrition, and psychological trauma were rampant, yet even in the face of such cruelty, captives drew on the resilience of their cultures, preserving elements of language, song, and ritual that would later become the bedrock of cultural survival in the Americas. Upon arrival, the enslaved were sold into plantation systems that demanded intense labor. From sugar and tobacco cultivation to cotton harvesting, all industries designed to maximize European profits while stripping the laborers of their autonomy and dignity. The goods produced by this coarse labor, sugar, cotton, tobacco, coffee, and rice, then traveled back across the Atlantic to Europe, fueling further industrial and commercial growth. European markets flourished with these commodities, enriching merchants, investors, and monarchies while reinforcing a global economic hierarchy built on exploitation. The triangular trade thus became more than a route of commerce. It was a mechanism that sustained empires, reshaped demographics, and entrenched systems of power that prioritized profit over human life. The movement of goods and people was meticulously organized, with each leg of the journey dependent on the other, forming an interlocking cycle where Europe provided capital and manufactured products, Africa supplied labor, and the Americas delivered raw materials. What makes this system particularly harrowing is how normalized it became. As generations of people, both enslaved and free, became enmeshed in its operations, European traders relied on local African intermediaries to capture and deliver individuals, often exploiting existing rivalries or conflicts between kingdoms, while African societies adapted to the new economic pressures, sometimes participating willingly for the sake of survival or political advantage. Meanwhile, in the Americas, the enslaved were forced to sustain production levels that fed European demand, their toil underpinning not just local economies but the broader rise of European global influence. This triangular connection illustrates how intimately linked human suffering and economic growth became during this era, with entire continents and populations drawn into a system that treated people as commodities and measured their value in terms of labor output and exchange potential. Yet, within this grim economic calculus, stories of resistance, resilience, and agency emerge. Enslaved Africans found ways to maintain cultural practices, form bonds, and, in races, resist the system that sought to erase their identities. Revolts aboard ships and on plantations, subtle forms of defiance, and the preservation of communal traditions all testified to the enduring human spirit. The triangular trade, while driven by exploitation and greed, also inadvertently created networks of cultural exchange, blending African, indigenous, and European influences that would shape societies in the Americas in profound and lasting ways. By examining this system, we can see how the Atlantic world was interconnected long before the age of modern globalization, a web of commerce and coercion that bound continents together while imposing staggering human costs. The triangular trade reveals the mechanisms by which profit and power were pursued at the expense of freedom, health, and human life, offering a lens through which to understand the economic and social foundations of the modern Atlantic world. It also emphasizes the importance of remembering the individuals whose labor, suffering, and resilience were at the heart of this system, honoring their stories, and acknowledging the historical forces that have shaped global inequalities and cultural legacies that persist to this day. Understanding the triangular trade is crucial, not only as a historical phenomenon but as a reminder of how human ingenuity and cruelty can coexist, and how the pursuit of wealth can have devastating human consequences when untempered by ethics or empathy. As we trace the flow of goods, labor, and raw materials across the Atlantic, we gain insight into the immense scale of the Atlantic slave trade, the resilience of those who endured it, and the deep historical roots of economic systems that continue to influence the world. This story of commerce, exploitation, and survival is not merely about economics. It is about human lives, the choices made by societies, and the legacies that echo across centuries, reminding us that history is never just about the past. It is about the people whose lives made that past real, and whose stories demand to be remembered. As the triangular trade reached its most harrowing stage, the human cost became undeniable, a stark testament to the brutality underpinning the economic systems of the time. Africans, once members of vibrant communities with their own traditions, professions, and social structures, were forcibly uprooted from their homes, often captured through raids or sold by intermediaries caught between survival and complicity. Families were torn apart in moments of terror, fathers separated from children, husbands from wives, and siblings from one another, leaving countless individuals stranded in a state of shock and despair before the long, perilous journey across the Atlantic even began. Upon arrival at the coastal forts and holding pens, captives were stripped of the identities that had defined their lives, given numbers or generic designations, and treated not as human beings but as commodities whose worth could be measured in currency or goods. The psychological weight of such dehumanization, compounded by the sudden loss of freedom and the knowledge that their fates lay entirely in the hands of strangers, imposed a trauma that would reverberate across generations. Boarding the slave ships, captives were confined in the bowels of vessels designed for efficiency rather than humanity. Below decks, the space allotted to each person was shockingly minimal, sometimes no larger than a coffin, forcing bodies into contorted positions for days on end. Chains bound hands and feet, preventing movement and any sense of personal autonomy. And the stench of human waste, sweat, and unwashed bodies permeated the crowded hold. Food and water were strictly rationed, often insufficient to sustain health, while disease spread rapidly through the packed quarters, claiming the lives of those weakened by hunger, fear, or injury. The crew enforced the rules of captivity with relentless discipline, using whips, rods, and threats to maintain order and suppress any hint of resistance, a grim reminder that survival depended not only on endurance but on compliance under unimaginable conditions. Branding was another instrument of dehumanization, a physical marker that symbolized ownership and control. Men and women, already stripped of their names and families, were burned with hot irons to signify possession, their flesh bearing permanent testimony to the commodification of their existence. Beyond the physical pain, branding carried an emotional and psychological toll, a visible reminder that freedom, heritage, and personal dignity had been violently stripped away. Even in this extreme state of vulnerability, enslaved Africans demonstrated resilience, adapting to harsh routines and finding ways to support one another. Small acts of resistance, whether through secret communication, shared songs, or attempts to maintain cultural practices, became acts of defiance and survival, preserving a sense of identity against the overwhelming machinery of exploitation. The Middle Passage, the Atlantic voyage that transported enslaved people to the Americas, was notorious not only for the mortality rate but for the sustained dehumanization imposed on those aboard. Captives endured months at sea, with cramped spaces, inadequate ventilation, and the constant threat of disease and death. Storms, rough seas, and accidents claimed additional lives, and psychological trauma compounded the physical suffering, as individuals grappled with the fear of the unknown and the reality that the lives they had known would never be restored. For many, the voyage represented the first stage of a lifetime of forced labor. Yet even in these early days, courage and solidarity emerged in subtle ways, with shared resistance, mutual support, and moments of cultural preservation providing threads of humanity amid overwhelming oppression. Upon reaching the Americas, the journey of suffering continued as captives were sold in markets, often publicly, where the dismemberment of families and the assessment of bodies for labor suitability were routine. Men were evaluated for strength, women for endurance, and children for potential, with no consideration for emotion, kinship, or personal history. Plantation life was harsh and unrelenting, with long hours of grueling work in fields, mines, or households, subject to physical punishment and rigid control. Every aspect of existence was dictated by those who saw the enslaved not as people but as instruments of production. Yet within this structure, Africans sought ways to retain their cultural heritage, to forge communities, and to maintain bonds of solidarity that would endure despite the violence inflicted upon them. The stripping of identity, the branding, the chains, and the inhuman conditions on the ships were not mere historical footnotes. They were central to the creation of a system that prioritized profit over humanity and reshaped entire continents through forced migration. They illustrate the lengths to which colonial powers went to maintain control, the scale of human suffering involved in the Atlantic slave trade, and the resilience of those who endured these conditions. Through these experiences, enslaved Africans carried with them stories, languages, music, and knowledge that would survive in the Americas, influencing the culture, society, and history of the regions in which they lived. By understanding the full scope of the journey from capture to forced labor, we gain insight into the scale of the Atlantic slave trade, the mechanisms of dehumanization, and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it. Each element from chains to branding to overcrowded ships was designed to erase individuality and enforce submission. Yet even under such extreme conditions, human endurance, solidarity, and cultural preservation persisted. This chapter of history underscores the depth of human suffering inflicted for economic gain, the intercontinental consequences of colonial systems, and the enduring strength of those who, against all odds, maintained their humanity in the face of relentless oppression. Amid the widespread suffering and systematic dehumanization of the Atlantic slave trade, moments of extraordinary courage and defiance emerged, reminding the world that even under the harshest oppression, the human spirit could not be fully extinguished. One of the most remarkable examples of such resistance occurred in 1839 aboard the Spanish slave ship, the Amistad, a vessel that had become a floating symbol of the cruelty inflicted on enslaved Africans, yet would also become a stage for one of the most compelling demonstrations of agency and courage in the history of slavery. The captives aboard the Amistad, recently abducted from West Africa and thrust into a journey that promised only toil, fear, and potential death, found themselves confined in the ship's hold, bound in chains and stripped of their names, histories, and dignity, their fates controlled entirely by those who saw them as property rather than people. Yet, within this dire situation, Joseph Sinke, a young man of remarkable resolve, emerged as a leader among the captives, rallying them with a clarity of purpose and a vision of freedom that transcended the immediate horrors surrounding them. The story of the Amistad revolt is both chilling and inspiring because it reveals the extraordinary lengths to which enslaved Africans were willing to go to reclaim autonomy over their lives. Under Sinke's leadership, 53 men, women, and children meticulously planned a revolt, understanding the risks they faced and the strength of the armed crew above them. When the moment came, they executed the uprising with decisive force, killing the captain and cook while sparing the life of the navigator, whose skills were essential to steering the ship. Their courage transformed them from powerless captives into agents of their own destiny, asserting that, even when every structural and physical measure had been imposed to deny them freedom, determination, strategy, and collective action could carve a path to self-liberation. This revolt demonstrated not only the desperation caused by enslavement but also the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit when confronted with injustice. Once the captives seized control of the Amistad, the challenge shifted from survival under captivity to navigating the perilous waters of the Atlantic without expertise in maritime travel. Their attempts to return to Africa were thwarted by unfamiliarity with the navigation required to cross the ocean. And ultimately, the ship was intercepted near Long Island, New York, by the Navy. The capture could have marked the end of hope, yet it became the beginning of a legal and political battle that would resonate far beyond the confines of a single ship. The Amistad captives, held in jail and threatened with being returned to Cuba, faced the risk of being enslaved once again. But their resistance had attracted attention from abolitionists in the United States. Individuals who recognized the legal and moral imperatives of the situation and were willing to advocate on behalf of the captives. Public sympathy, legal strategy, and the involvement of prominent figures such as former President John Quincy Adams combined to transform the fate of these captives, ultimately resulting in a Supreme Court decision in their favor that acknowledged their right to resist unlawful enslavement. The Amistad Revolt is remarkable not only for the physical bravery it demonstrated but for the broader social and historical implications it carried. It challenged the assumptions underpinning the legality and morality of the transatlantic slave trade at a moment when slavery remained entrenched across the Americas. The revolt and subsequent trial highlighted the moral and ethical contradictions inherent in systems that claimed legal authority to deny the most basic human freedoms while simultaneously asserting economic and political control. The victory of the Amistad captives in the Supreme Court was a symbolic triumph for human rights, demonstrating that even within deeply entrenched systems of oppression, justice could occasionally be achieved, and human agency could prevail. Moreover, their return to Africa in 1842, accompanied by missionaries and teachers who helped establish educational institutions, underscored the long-term impact of their actions, transforming personal resistance into a catalyst for broader social and cultural restoration. This story also illuminates the paradox of power and resistance within the broader context of the Atlantic slave trade. While European empires had designed systems to commodify, control, and exploit African labor, and while African intermediaries often participated in the trade under duress or political expediency, the Amistad Revolt reminds us that enslaved individuals were not passive participants in history. They possessed awareness, strategic thinking, and a deep desire for freedom that could manifest even under extreme duress. Their revolt serves as a vivid counterpoint to the narrative of inevitability that often surrounds the history of slavery, emphasizing that resistance, whether large-scale or subtle, was a continuous thread running through the experiences of the enslaved. The Amistad Revolt also had far-reaching cultural and historical resonance, inspiring abolitionist movements in the United States and abroad. It forced societies to confront the human consequences of slavery, revealing that economic systems built on exploitation were inseparable from profound ethical failures. The story emphasizes the importance of individual and collective courage, illustrating how determined action, even by those with the least formal power, can challenge entrenched institutions and ignite social and legal change. By asserting their humanity, the captives aboard the Amistad transformed a moment of profound oppression into a story of resilience, hope, and justice, leaving a legacy that continues to inspire those who study the history of resistance against systemic injustice. In tracing the journey from capture in Africa to revolt on the high seas, we see a powerful narrative of agency within one of history's most oppressive systems. The Amistad Revolt reminds us that human beings, even when treated as property, retain the capacity for courage, innovation, and moral action, and that acts of resistance, no matter how small or localized, ripple outward to create lasting consequences for individuals, societies, and historical memory. In remembering the Amistad, we honor the resilience of those who refuse to be defined by chains, asserting instead the fundamental right to freedom, dignity, and self-determination, a right that endures in the conscience of the world long after the era of transatlantic slavery has ended. The history of the Atlantic slave trade is often framed as a story of European exploitation, yet to understand its full complexity, one must also examine the role of African leaders and communities who became deeply entangled in the system, sometimes by choice, other times by circumstance, revealing a network of incentives, alliances, and pressures that shaped the continent's engagement with transatlantic commerce. Within West and Central Africa, certain rulers recognized the economic and political potential of engaging with European traders, establishing trade networks that exchanged captives for firearms, textiles, alcohol, and other goods coveted by local elites. These arrangements were not uniform, and motivations varied widely. In some cases, the capture and sale of individuals were a byproduct of ongoing conflicts, tribal wars, or raids aimed at weakening rival communities, while in others, it was a calculated strategy to finance future campaigns, secure political dominance, or eliminate perceived threats within their own territories. Yet, even within this framework of complicity, there were leaders and societies that resisted or sought to limit the trade, understanding its destructive consequences and the moral and social costs imposed on their people. The dynamics of African involvement in the slave trade illustrate a complex interplay between agency, coercion, and economic opportunity. Rulers such as those of the Dahomey Kingdom established structured systems in which prisoners of war, criminals, and captives from neighboring villages were sold to European slavers, often with strict oversight to ensure that the trade served the state's interests without undermining internal social stability. These captives were stripped of their identities, labeled merely as commodities, and transported away from lands they had known all their lives. Even as these elites engaged in such commerce, they were acutely aware of the human cost, sometimes issuing decrees that prohibited the enslavement of certain groups within their own society, reflecting an internal moral calculus that sought to balance profit with a sense of communal responsibility. For example, in the Dahomey Kingdom, while the institution of slavery was widely accepted as a form of commerce and labor, the law forbade enslaving fellow Dahomey citizens, with violations punishable by death, highlighting a nuanced moral boundary amid the broader acceptance of human commodification. Across the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana, other powerful families developed strategic relationships with European traders through marriage, trade agreements, and political alliances, a practice sometimes referred to as kasari. By marrying daughters to European merchants, African elites created bonds that facilitated trade and ensured a degree of control over transactions, while also embedding themselves into the emerging global economic system. Children of influential families were often sent abroad with traders or to study in European institutions, bridging cultural and commercial worlds in a way that reinforced the continent's entanglement with the Atlantic economy. Yet, for many ordinary Africans, the consequences of these elite-level arrangements were devastating. Village communities were raided, families were separated, and individuals were sold to strangers who valued them only for labor potential and physical strength. The perception of Europeans as cannibals in some regions, though exaggerated, reflected local fears of what could happen to those captured, adding layers of psychological terror to the already brutal reality of abduction and forced migration. The motivations for African participation in the trade were diverse, shaped by internal politics, survival strategies, and external pressures from European powers eager to maximize the flow of captives. Some communities found that selling captives provided critical resources for defense, enabling them to arm militias or fund campaigns to expand territory, while others sought to eliminate political rivals or settle disputes with neighboring groups. Often, captives were members of enemy ethnic groups or prisoners of war, removed from social and cultural networks that might otherwise provide protection. In many instances, those sold into slavery were considered other, not belonging to the ethnic or political group that captured them, which allowed traders and local leaders to rationalize their actions within existing social hierarchies. The intersection of European demand, local economic incentives, and intergroup rivalries created a feedback loop in which the trade expanded and became increasingly normalized, even as it inflicted irreparable harm on countless individuals and communities. At the same time, African opposition to the trade was neither absent nor ineffective. Leaders who sought to curtail or regulate the sale of captives often petitioned European powers to change the nature of goods supplied, hoping to reduce the scale of conflict and coercion that fueled raids and abductions. Letters from Afonso I of Congo to the Portuguese crown, for instance, reveal appeals to replace weapons and alcohol with missionaries and educational resources, a request grounded in both humanitarian concern and a desire to preserve the kingdom's social fabric. Such actions illustrate that even within the broader system of complicity, there were voices advocating for restraint, ethical engagement, and the protection of communities from the destructive forces unleashed by the transatlantic trade. These appeals, however, were frequently ignored or undermined by the unrelenting profit motives of European merchants, underscoring the asymmetry of power and the difficulty of imposing moral limits on a system designed for extraction and exploitation. The duality of African involvement in the slave trade underscores the complexity of historical narratives. While European powers designed the mechanisms of transport, commodification, and enforcement, African leaders and communities contributed to the operation and perpetuation of these systems, sometimes as willing participants, sometimes under pressure, and occasionally in opposition. Understanding this multiplicity of roles challenges simplistic portrayals of historical culpability and illuminates the intricate networks of agency, coercion, and strategy that defined the Atlantic world. It also highlights the tragic reality that the consequences of the trade were borne disproportionately by those with the least power, the captives themselves, whose lives, cultures, and families were irrevocably altered or destroyed in the pursuit of profit and political advantage. Ultimately, the story of African participation in the transatlantic slave trade is one of paradox and nuance, reflecting the intersection of economic opportunity, political necessity, moral consideration, and human suffering. It reveals that while some individuals and states sought to mitigate harm or assert ethical boundaries, the overwhelming incentives created by European demand, combined with local ambitions and rivalries, propelled millions into bondage. The legacy of this involvement is woven into the social, political, and cultural fabric of Africa and the Americas, leaving lessons about the complexity of complicity, the consequences of commodifying human lives, and the enduring resilience of those who survived and resisted within this brutal system. As we reach the closing chapters of this harrowing story, it is impossible not to reflect on the staggering human cost of the Atlantic slave trade and the enduring legacy it has left on the world. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, millions of Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, stripped of their identities, and subjected to unimaginable suffering during the transatlantic voyage and in the brutal labor systems of the Americas. For every life that survived the Middle Passage, countless others perished, victims of disease, malnutrition, abuse, and despair. The death toll alone is staggering, estimated at over 1 million during the journey itself, with many more dying from the violence of raids, warfare, and forced marches before even reaching the ships. These deaths were not isolated incidents but part of a systemic machinery of human exploitation, driven by profit, colonial ambition, and a disregard for the intrinsic value of human life. The cultural consequences of this massive forced migration are equally profound. Entire communities were destabilized, local traditions disrupted, and social structures irrevocably altered. Languages, customs, and spiritual practices were lost or transformed, blending in complex ways with those of the Americas, creating new cultural forms while erasing elements of African heritage. Families were torn apart, with parents separated from children, siblings from one another, and entire lineages scattered across oceans. The psychological scars of these disruptions reverberated through generations, shaping identities, social relations, and community cohesion both in Africa and in the Americas. The human cost was not only immediate but generational, with repercussions still visible in modern societies through patterns of inequality, cultural dislocation, and systemic disenfranchisement. Even today, nations continue to grapple with the historical consequences of this dark chapter. The economic advantages gained by European colonial powers came at the expense of African communities, creating structural imbalances that persisted long after the abolition of the trade. The wealth generated by enslaved labor laid the foundations for industrial development in Europe and the Americas, while African societies faced depopulation, social fragmentation, and political destabilization. The echoes of these historical injustices are evident in ongoing disparities in wealth, education, and political influence across continents, reminding us that the legacies of slavery are not merely historical footnotes but living realities that demand attention, understanding, and action. In response to this enduring legacy, international recognition and memorialization efforts have emerged, seeking to honor the millions of lives lost and educate future generations about the horrors of the slave trade. UNESCO's designation of August 23 as the International Day for the Remembrance of the Slave Trade and its abolition marks a global commitment to acknowledging this history and the suffering it caused. Memorials, museums, and educational initiatives worldwide aim to provide spaces for reflection, remembrance, and dialogue, ensuring that the stories of the enslaved are not forgotten. These efforts serve not only as acts of historical acknowledgement, but also as instruments for cultivating empathy, promoting human rights, and fostering a commitment to justice and equality in the present and future. The story of the Atlantic slave trade is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of systematic oppression. While it is a narrative of immense suffering and moral failure, it is also a story of resistance, courage, and the unyielding desire for freedom. Figures like Joseph Sinker of the Amistad Revolt embody the enduring human capacity to challenge injustice, reclaim dignity, and assert agency even under the most oppressive conditions. These acts of defiance remind us that history is not solely defined by systems of power but also by the choices, bravery, and humanity of those who resisted them. As we reflect on this history, it is crucial to remember that the lessons of the past are not abstract. They inform our understanding of the present and guide our actions for the future. Recognizing the full scope of the Atlantic slave trade compels us to confront inequality, challenge systems of oppression, and honor the humanity of every individual. It calls on societies to educate themselves, commemorate those who suffered, and work toward a world where such atrocities are never repeated. Remembering this history is not simply an act of retrospection but a moral imperative, a call to uphold the dignity, rights, and potential of all people, irrespective of background, race, or circumstance. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through one of history's most significant yet often underrepresented stories. Your willingness to engage with this past is a powerful step toward understanding, empathy, and positive action. If you found this video enlightening and thought-provoking, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more content exploring history in depth. By doing, you not only support our work, but also contribute to keeping these important stories alive for generations to come, ensuring that the lessons of history continue to resonate and inspire meaningful change.